The debate between hard drives versus SSDs has been raging for a few years now, and we finally have the solution to the battle that's been raging for all this time. So what's the difference between these two different types of storage? So let's start with HDD. HDD is an acronym for hard disk drive and is typically referred to as a hard drive. An HDD comes in either 3.5 inch or 2.5 inch sizes. This measurement is actually the diameter of the disk inside of the hard drive, with each HDD having several disks stacked on top of each other with a mechanical arm moving between the disks to scan for data. HDDs have the cheapest capacity to cost ratio but are slower and can fail because of the moving parts inside of it. In order to access data from an HDD, your computer must first decide where the data is located on the physical disk, and then send the mechanical arm with the read and write head on it to the location of the data. This can create latency in the data access times. More expensive HDDs usually have a higher RPM, with higher-end hard drives operating at around 15,000 RPM, but most consumer hard drives operating at about 7,200 RPM. So how do HDDs store data? It's actually kind of interesting and clever. The modern hard drive was born about 60 years ago, made by IBM, who produced the first high-capacity hard drives. These hard drives had a capacity of 5 megabytes, and they were the size of a refrigerator. Each disk, or platter, was about 2 feet in diameter and had about 50 platters in each stack. Each platter had tiny magnets in it, with the polarity of the magnets representing either a 1 or a 0. This technology is still used today, but in a much smaller form. The first modern 3.5 inch HDD arrived in the early 1980s, but it still only had a capacity of a couple of megabytes. The first modern high-capacity multi-terabyte consumer hard drive arrived in early 2009. Ever since then, hard drives have gotten larger capacities but have remained the same size with the same basic technology pioneered by IBM in the 1950s. One of the biggest downsides to a hard drive is that it has moving parts inside of it. That's why it's so dangerous to drop them. You might accidentally puncture or scratch one of the disks inside the hard drive with the read and write head if you drop it from more than a couple of feet up. So to get back to the first question, how are hard drives different from SSDs? The term SSD is an acronym standing for solid-state drive. A solid-state drive has no moving parts inside of it and is instead a circuit board. Many modern SSDs store data in what's known as NAND flash, and instead of using magnetic polarity to store binary code, SSDs use electrical signals to do the task. Because of the lack of moving parts, SSDs are much faster than the average hard drive, exhibiting nearly twice the speed of the average HDD. SSDs have only become widely available in the last 10 years or so, and before then, what's referred to as bubble memory was usually soldered onto the motherboard of computers in the 1980s. Before the rise of the modern SSD, users created RAM drives, which were incredibly fast, but because of the volatility of RAM, data couldn't be stored between boots. That's why RAM drives aren't really used today. The drawback to an SSD is that each NAND module can only be written to and changed a specific number of times. A hard drive can theoretically be written to and have data changed for as long as the mechanical arm works. However, SSDs can only be used a certain amount of times before the modules inside of it die. The other drawback to SSDs is long-term storage. Because the data inside of an SSD is an electrical signal, the strength of the signal weakens over time. With a hard drive, you can theoretically unplug it and set it on a shelf for as long as you need it to be. An SSD is a bit different. If you just unplug your SSD and then plug it in a few days later, your data will most likely be fine. But if you unplug your SSD and put it on a shelf for a few years, your data will become corrupted or just be missing when you go back to plug it in. So, overall, which one is better? Well, neither is really better than the other, they're just different. Hard drives are a more reliable and cheaper way to store data, while SSDs have fast access times but at a higher cost. It all comes down to what you're planning to do with it. If you're planning on building a workstation where all of your video files are stored on a server, then an SSD is what you will want. However, if you're building a mass storage PC, hard drives are definitely the way to go. If you're building a gaming PC, the common way to go about storage is to have a low-capacity SSD store your operating system and then a hard drive to store your games and other files. This setup has quick boot times, but allows for higher storage capacity for files that don't rely on speed. The times for which you want to use an SSD or a hard drive are very case dependent, but at the end of the day, your purchasing decision should be based on what you plan to use your computer for. Buying a 2TB SSD is a huge waste of money when you could mix and match both an SSD and a hard drive and have more total storage on your PC. Most storage manufacturers are now producing hybrid drives, which pack both an SSD and a hard drive into one package. They are cheaper than buying the two separately and are highly recommended for those of you on a budget. If you want to stay up to date on all the latest tech, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.